Hello guys and welcome back to Counter 10. My name is Arnie and today on the episode I'm joined by Maurice Hennessy. Now I usually don't do big intros, but Maurice certainly deserves one. He is now a retired learning and development facilitator for ANZCA after 12 years and he's got a huge background in education. He spent 20 years of his career in pediatric nursing, being pivotal in the role of education, advisory and curriculum development all across the world, with the majority of his work in Vietnam and Papua New Guinea. He's passionate about education and has spent a lot of time with the ANZCA Educators course. I've asked him to join me today because over the summer, we've been collaborating at creating our very own original guideline titled Conversation Starters in the Operating Theatre. This guideline hopes to improve learning opportunities in the trainee-supervisor interaction that we are so part of every day in the operating theatre. And the need for this document comes back from reflecting on my own training journey. I was never one to take the opportunity to really maximize my learning opportunities when I was in the operating theatre, and that's where we spend majority of the day. I always found there were certain instances where I'd have great teaching days and then other days that would be not so great. And I could never figure out why these inconsistencies within my working day exist. So from this, we created this document that has some tips and tricks and some examples to make every day at work the best day at work for learning and maximizing those learning opportunities, and working together with your supervisor to maximize your learning goals. And on top of that, this is a perfect time for a document like this. With the start of the new hospital year, there's a lot of new trainees out there, and this document can hopefully be used by a new trainee, a trainee in the middle of their training, or a trainee like me who's about to finish their training. So I hope you get something out of today's conversation, and our education tool will be released on Sweet Dreams Anesthesia as soon as this podcast is uploaded. And I hope you guys utilize it, and as always, send me through your feedback. With that said, let's dive into our conversation.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi Maurice, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast and taking time out of your day to be part of this episode.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, I'll just bring the listeners back to when we first met. I first interacted with you last year at one of the ANZCA combined special interest groups talks, which was mainly focused on medical education. And you gave a talk that was titled, "What Questions Are We Not Asking?" And while I was hearing you speak, the thought that I was reflecting on was that during my own training time, I really wasn't very good at studying in the hospital, or more specifically, wasn't really good at picking up learning opportunities within the theatre environment. And it made me reflect as I'm now transitioning from more of a trainee role to a more supervisory trainee role of how we could improve that interaction and improve the learning opportunities for trainees. And it's kind of got us talking over the summer and made us create this document that we've been creating over the summer that's titled Conversation Starters in the Operating Theatre, which we'll talk about a bit later. And it's all to do with kind of optimizing learning opportunities for the trainee and the supervisor interaction. But before we get on talking about that, can I just ask you what your first experience was observing the trainee-supervisor relationship within the operating theatre space?
Thanks, Arnie. Yeah, in my 12 years with ANZCA, I spent many hours in operating theatres and always curious about how could we make sure what we're doing was practical to the day-to-day environment. And my first experience was quite enlightening, actually, into an operating theatre. And after a while, I asked the trainee what was the learning plan for today, and the trainee's response was whatever the consultant wants to teach me. And I said, well, that's interesting. Is there anything in particular you're interested in? And he said, well, I've got this nephrectomy happening. We've got a supine position. I'm interested in what would happen if things go wrong with the airway. And I said, would you not suggest this to the consultant. They said, oh, no, no. So I went to the consultant separately and I said, I'm just wondering, what's the plan for learning today? And she said, we'll see what comes up. And I thought, this is a big barrier. And I said, could that possibly be the airway management of the supine patient? But so that was my first experience, which was very enlightening because, again, that one of the things through the ANZCA Educator program, which I would highly recommend to trainees, as well as the consultants, is the fact of trying to think about how does this learning happen? And in the ANZCA Educator program, we look at the first place is about psychological safety, sits in the middle. And it sounded to me from that conversation that trainee wasn't feeling psychologically safe enough to have the conversation with the consultant, potentially. I know I'm making an assumption here, but there was a barrier, and I didn't explore that. But then we think about needs assessment, planning, implementation, evaluation, feedback, and that closes the loop. And this is, we talk about that in terms of planning a session, but this is very relevant, I think, also to the learning and teaching that happens in an operating.
Now, I think that key term of psychological safety, it happens without even thinking about it. I remember feeling like what you've described that trainee feeling multiple times in the operating theatre, where with certain supervisors, you don't feel like you can ask them any question that you want. And it might not be the opposite case where the supervisor is probably happy for you to ask questions, but you don't feel comfortable asking that question. And then you work with certain supervisors where automatically, for whatever reason, you feel like you can just have a friendly conversation with them. Like they're almost your mates. You can ask them any stupid question that comes into your head and they'll answer it and you don't feel judged there. And I don't know how you make an environment where it's automatically feels like that. I believe some of it's going to be personality based as well, because everyone has a different personality and some personality is going to clash. And that's kind of the crux of how we came about thinking, how can we improve this trainee supervisor relationship by having this document that's going to be released on Sweet Dreams Anesthesia called Conversation Starters in the operating theatre, to make conversation starters that could be applied in 5 different scenarios that we give examples for, where it mitigates that fact of uncomfortable scenarios. You're trying to build psychological safety by asking questions that you'd be hoping that the supervisor would feel open to answering and the trainee would feel comfortable in asking. There's a thing that I think me and you have talked about as prior to our recording about learner needs, but also being a curious learner. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the term, what is a curious learner?
Yeah, I think that highlighting again the example that you're sharing is at the crux of some of the conversations that we've had, is because what we end up with is 2 views of the world, and so there's the supervisor and there's the trainee, and I think one of the things that, in my observation in the operating theatre, people worked together, but they didn't often have a conversation about expectations of what it was like today. So, for example, from the consultant's perspective, if they're already cognitively overloaded by the cases that are coming today, but they don't share that this is where they're at, and the focus today is going to be primarily on patient care and supporting the patient, and any learning may occur. And the trainee is expecting to get some learning opportunities, that we get a disconnect. And so I think part of the conversation we've had around those conversation starters is, whilst, ideally we do want the supervisors to be initiating these conversations to help with that psychological safety, but potentially by being curious, the trainee can take a little bit more ownership of the environment, because I believe everybody's innately curious, but there are things that happen in the environment that sometimes blocks that curiosity. And so the tension that occurs in an operating theatre from A, the pressure of work, but B, the relationships we're talking about, a whole range of factors can impact on that environment. And as a learner, and I've had occasions where you ask questions and you get put down, or the questions are ignored, or in the end you learn to stop asking questions. But maybe what I'm thinking about here in being curious is, if the needs of the trainee aren't being met, is to frame a question to ask, hey, I wonder what's happening today in terms of learning opportunities. I wonder if it would be possible. Today, I'm interested in, we haven't worked together before, or we've only worked together recently, and I noticed X. I noticed you did something particularly that I'm interested whether we could work with that, or simply I've been thinking about, where I'm at. Was in a theatre yesterday. We had a feedback conversation, and I'm needing to do a bit more work with bougies. Just wondering, could we build that in today if the opportunities arise? So being curious in that way. And then I think from the conversations that come from it is suspending judgment, as I think is an important skill for both the supervisor and the trainee, is when we get some information, something happens with the supervisor, rather than making a judgment about that supervisor, is take a step back and maybe ask ourselves, I wonder what's going on for this person.
I think that suspending judgment, that last point that you're just trying to make there, is really true. And I just got me thinking of something. I have a little 2-year-old daughter, and we're watching a video, my wife and I, on kind of, how to improve parenting skills. And one of the tips was, wouldn't it be nice if you and your partner, depending on, how the day's gone, just told each other on a scale of 1 to 10, how much energy you have to look after the kid at the moment, so that the other person can either pick you up or down, and you can work together. And so you would say, I've got 9 out of 10, I've got lots of energy today, and you need to have a sleep because you were up all night last night and you're at a 2. And wouldn't it be great if at the start of the day, that's how the trainee supervisor relationship started? If the supervisor came in and said, I've had a really rough day yesterday. My ability to teach at the moment is a 2 out of 10. And the trainee will then know automatically, actually, this is not a great day. It has nothing to do with the supervisor, and actually an open relationship. But we don't do that because we don't have these type of conversations, because many of us aren't really good at teaching. And many of us don't know when a learning moment is occurring, whether we see it or not. And that's kind of a big shame, because big part of the anesthetic training program and a core fundamental principle is to be a teacher and an educator. But as a cohort, we are not great teachers, because we get so focused on making sure that patients are safe that sometimes we take away the learning opportunities of the trainee that we're working from in more favor of making sure patient safety. And this led to kind of scenarios that we had put into this document. And like the first scenario is the pre-medication phone call the night before, which most trainees would make to a supervisor to discuss the cases. And this is a great basis to start a learning opportunity moment, because you have to make this phone call or a text, but you can say things like, I would really like to improve my skills on airway assessment. Can I get your feedback on this and use it to complete a work-based placed assessment, which sets the tone, it sets an agenda, and it gives you an outcome that you can measure at the end of the day. Or yesterday I was working with a consultant and I felt like I wasn't quite up to speed on my skills of doing X, and I'd really like to work on that and get your feedback on this. These little things that you can add onto these conversations that you're having, I think can really shape the day that you're going to have, and also change the perspective of what the supervisor thinks of the trainee and what the trainee thinks of the supervisor.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly there, Arnie. And I think you're raising a couple of really important points. And the main thing is here is trying to encourage the trainees to drive their learning a bit more. Now, clearly there are restrictions on a whole range of levels, but having that sort of conversation will bring to the attention. One of the things I would say, in my time in the operating theatres, I saw a lot of good teaching happening. and good intentions, but after as I say, that lack of awareness of each other's expectation was a big barrier, which is where the curiosity part comes in. But I do think, again, one of the things I would have observed in my conversations with supervisors was they weren't going to make an effort unless the trainee was making an effort. So if the trainee wants to ask questions, there was a connection. And I'm not saying that's right, but that was an impression that I got from some. I'm happy to do it, but it's not my training.
As I transition from a trainee to a supervisor, I can see why that occurs. Because as a trainee, you feel like it's an obligation of a supervisor to teach. And as a supervisor, you feel like the obligation to teach is only there if the trainee shows initiation and enthusiasm. Those two things sometimes don't meet. How do we kind of mitigate that to where I think both parties come out feeling like they've got something out of it? And so for those situations, we have another example, the situation where it's too hectic in the theater to teach at the moment, and there's lots of things happening right now. So what do? How, as a trainee, you can see that this is a stressful situation for the supervisor. Can you make this a learning moment? And tips that we have are simple things like once that stressful situation finishes, you said just take one thing away that you're observing and discuss that one thing. And so you could say, in that stressful, difficult airway situation, I saw the way you communicated with the anesthetic assistant was using this type of language. Was this something that you practice, or how did that come about? Or simply, while the situation was unfolding, what was going through your head as differentials? And those little things, and the way I think a trainee frames that question to the supervisor, puts down the guard of the supervisor from like, oh, you're not criticizing me, you're actually wanting some information. Because I truly think no one ever wants to be criticized. And this comes to the thing, what's the difference between criticism and feedback? And we all want good feedback, and we don't want to be criticized for what we do.
Thank you. Now you're in an area of my passion, which is the feedback conversation, and one of the things that I tried hard in my time with Ansgar was to get away from the concept of good or bad or positive or negative feedback, because the feedback in itself is neutral, in my view, and it's what we do with it, is whether it makes it positive or negative potentially. However, if we take what we've been talking about at the moment, that if the trainee has asked the supervisor for feedback on a particular aspect of their practice, that getting that feedback in the first place is a gift. And is it more likely to be received positively because that's what they asked for, versus unsolicited feedback that then gets interpreted as negative?
What makes a good trainee supervisor relationship work well? When you've seen great learning moments and great teaching, what separates that from the not so great teaching?
Well, I think the again, that whole aspect at the beginning of making clear expectations is very powerful. That the trainee coming with being taking some responsibility for the things that they learn, and a willingness by the supervisor to be adaptable. So again, as you've said, clearly patient safety, there are a whole range of non-negotiables. But taking the opportunity to do some planned learning can be helpful, but also the ones where you can utilize the opportunistic learning that occurs. And I think that in some of the really good interactions has been where the supervisor has really been able to align with what the trainees' needs were in a learning sense. And so one example that I had, there was a trainee, they're in the process, they're in their study mode for the primary exam. And they were not clearly, it would appear that they weren't really focused on what was going on in the theatre. And the supervisor said, hey, how are you going? Oh, I'm okay, just feeling a bit overwhelmed with the study. And the supervisor said, what did you study last night? And they said, nerve polarization. They said, well, on the whiteboard there, just go and draw what you know about nerve polarization. And off the trainee went. And then they started to talk about the drugs they were giving. And the change in energy in this trainee was remarkable.
I feel like it takes a certain skill as a supervisor to recognize that.
In terms of saying it may well be, it takes a certain supervisor to do that. Once again, I think this ties in with what we're talking about, learner agency, because again, if that learner was able to say, I'm overwhelmed at the moment with what I'm studying, any chance we could work with this? Or, that is, I'm not saying it will necessarily work, because I know that not all supervisors are part one savvy, but been talking to a consultant recently, and in their hospital, they've picked up on the fact that the pass rate for the exam wasn't as good as they would have liked. And now that in their hospital, each consultant is taking 2 primary subjects, and they're going to be capable of interacting with trainees at any given time. So I just want to make the point, there are good things happening out there, but the thing we can't control is the system we're working in. But if the trainee is able to recognize their learning needs and then bring those forward in a curious way, as we've been describing, I think that might be a step forward.
And that probably all comes back to your initial statement, which was making a space which is psychologically safe.
Yeah.
Because that enables both that interaction to occur and then to flourish.
Yeah. And so going on to fast goals, I think, once again, this is trying to connect the dots to the conversation we've already had about that pre-theatre phone call or whatever, the opportunity to share a goal. And so learning goals, we talk about SMART goals being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timeline. They're behavioural. Fast is a little bit more generative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we want is that they need to be frequently discussed. So again, what often happens is people discuss a goal at the beginning of the list, but it never gets discussed again. But if we're doing something that's procedurally based, the chances are it's probably occurring in each of the cases. So at the end of each case, just making enough time just to touch on one point of the goal. Are we working towards it? Where are we achieving? It needs to be ambitious. One of the things that workplace-based assessments were designed to do was to stretch the trainee. But I think in reality, trainees wait until they can get independent practice before they really do WBAs. Happy to be corrected on that, but that's been my observation. And if you start to use the WBA in a way that stretches you, no, you won't get a 10 as independent, 9 as independent, but at the moment at your stage of training, this is where you're at a 5. What do you need to get to be a 6? And then doing frequent WBAs in that way. I know I've gone off topic here a little bit, but being ambitious. So again, not having a goal that you can achieve to impress. Take a goal that you can achieve, that you're striving for, to extend your learning. And then they need to be specific. So we need to be clear about what we're doing, what the outcome will look like. And the last part is transparent, which means that we're sharing them. And so one of the things that we talk about is this being behavioral learning. So in sense of an arterial line, as part of the training, you have to insert X number of arterial lines. So as a behavioral objective, we're going to do X number. But if we want to use these fast goals and be a little bit more generative in our learning goal, it's not just about inserting X number, it's saying the goal is to be able to justify the use of certain techniques in different contexts when putting in arterial line. So that changes. So the outcome is still wanting to be able to put in the arterial line, but the learning that goes to be able to do it in the different contexts is able to be adapted. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like essentially taking a spin on what you think is actually you're learning from it. And I think just applying it to my own practice, just going back to when you're talking about fast goals and receiving feedback. I was recently looking after this case in recovery. I was working with a consultant and we were looking after this crisis situation in recovery. It was a pediatric patient who had essentially a partially obstructed airway. And we maneuvered this patient in a left lateral position, and the airway seemed to improve and be patent. And I was really keen to put an airway Gadell in this patient. And the consultant said, "You really want to put this in, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." So we put the airway Gadell in, and then the consultant there said, "Grab your stethoscope and put it on the patient's neck and tell me what you can hear." And I said, "Oh, the airflow seems really nice and patent. It's very laminar. There doesn't seem to be any obstruction." And I'd never done that before in all my 5 years of training. And he then took the Gadell out and he said, "What does it sound like now?" And I said, "Exactly the same." And
Mm,
he said, "Well, there you go. This patient doesn't need a Gadell. The airway's nice and patent with just the maneuvers that we've done." And I was just blown away.
mm, mm.
This wasn't a planned learning moment, but for me, it was a really important learning moment because I just learned in that second that I've picked up a skill and now I can teach to other people.
Yeah, yeah.
And hearing what you were saying, it's the trainee's role to also express when they're feeling overwhelmed. Although I came away with something amazing there, what I didn't do was say to the supervisor, "Hey, that was really amazing. And I really appreciate that. And I don't think many people know that. And I think you should teach that to other people as well."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
looking back on it, it's kind of the way that you're reframing things in terms of how you set yourself goals and objectives. So when you get that fast goal or you have a great day where you do learn a lot, how do then you reciprocate that back to the supervisor so
Mm,
that that momentum carries on to the supervisor working with the next trainee? And then for yourself, when you work with the next supervisor, that momentum carries on as well. And it
yeah,
creates this
yeah.
cultural change, which is infectious for a department. And I think overall, when you can have safe conversations, you also then feed back to having better patient care. This, I keep referring to this document that we're creating called Conversation Starters in the Operating Theatre, which seems really basic, but it's something that I wish I had when I started training.
Mm, mm.
Um, like I said at the start, I wasn't very good at optimizing my learning in theatre. I usually spent most of my time trying to learn at home, and that compromised my ability to be with my family, take time for myself. And if you can optimize learning opportunities in the workplace, you can minimize learning time at home, which creates more free time overall.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely agree. Again, the more learning that you can do in that space. And I think just listening there, Arnie, you're opening the door to a new document called Conversations Closes.
Yeah.
Because I think that, there's a really important point that you're bringing forward there is that feedback is a two-way process. And again, that if we could encourage trainees to get into the habit at the end of a list of saying thank you, not just thank you, thinking about it in the fast goal way. There might not have been a goal specifically, but if we can be specific, thank you, Arnie, for what we did today. I particularly found it helpful when you showed me X. Or I found it particularly helpful when you took the time to have that feedback conversation. So if we can encourage the trainees to thank the supervisor for what they've done during the list and highlight one thing, that what would that do to the supervisor trainee relationship, as well as modeling to the supervisor something that they could build into their practice, as opposed to thank you, good job today.
Which is what we all do invariably, right? But we can
Yeah,
just we can just make it just that little bit better. And
yeah,
it's kind of brings us to, I think maybe we'll finish up soon and on this episode because it's just supposed to be a quick episode to kind of announce that this document's being released on the website, and hopefully the people listening share it within the hospital that they're working at. and not just share it between trainees, but share it among supervisors too, because I think this will show the supervisors that the trainees are interested in learning and create that mutual kind of excitement of
Mm,
learning
mm.
opportunities, which is the goal of this. And it's not a perfect document that we've created. It's definitely just something that we're starting with. And the other things that I think we want to touch on just briefly was how do you then optimize learning and studying outside the workplace, and within this document we'll have some other resources that look at kind of 6 strategies to improve your studying techniques essentially outside. And do you mind just touching on those 6 strategies, Maurice?
Oh, sure. But they come from the work of Megan Sumeraki and neuroscience space, and they've been around for a number of years now. And the first two, I mean, are spaced learning and retrieval learning, and they work very nicely together. And these are probably the two that are most have been studied the most to shown to be effective, although all 6 have got good evidence base. But spaced learning is, again, it's, as we all know, there's no point in studying for the primary exam in the last 3 months of the year, because cramming might give you some immediate relief, but the information doesn't stay very long. The idea of spacing is that you study topics today, and then in perhaps 3 weeks' time you revisit them. So there's a whole revisiting that goes on. And that by spacing your practice and then using retrieval practice, so if I've studied some pharmacology today, in 3 weeks' time I go back to the same pharmacology. Instead of doing the reading and the rereading, we test ourselves on what we remember about the pharmacology that we studied. So we ask those same questions we asked ourselves when we were studying. We recall the information by writing it down, drawing diagrams, talking out loud to the dog, to your 2-year-old child if they'll stay still long enough. And so you do all of this recall, and then what this enables you to see is what have you actually remembered. So what you've actually remembered, you don't need to spend time on. You can then just spend the time on the bits that you have forgotten. And this is where this is the idea of spaced learning. It's learning is hard, and so it's the forgetting and the relearning is what strengthens the pathway for remembering. But we don't then have to spend our time reading things that we already know. So that whilst it seems time inefficient to begin with, over time it becomes more efficient. And like any new skill, it takes a while to adapt. And so you would probably find that you would cover X amount of information with your rereading technique. And doing this at the beginning will take longer, but it's a new skill.
Hmm.
Yeah, so with interleaving, this again is a well-recognized idea that instead of just doing pharmacology for 3 hours, you might do pharmacology, cardiac, and respiratory of an hour each, that interlinking things that are similarities and looking for those connections will help with, again, recall. And this is the beginning of not just recall, but it's also the understanding. And again, so if you, for example, did a 3-hour block with those 3 topics today, in 3 weeks' time when you study them, don't do them in the same order. Read them, instead of doing ABC, do BCA. And the next time you study them, do CBA. Because we don't recall our information in a linear fashion. So this helps the brain to start to take those connections and make the information easier to retrieve down the track. So this is about helping us to start to do the recognition and differentiation of information. So when people are able to start to make choices of A over B in different situations.
All these principles that you're saying, or strategies, you can also use them in theatre. So you don't have to use them at home. So an example would be in theatre, as one of the scenarios, if you're by yourself and you have a nurse or a technician with you, you can talk to them about drugs that are in your trolley and then go to your next list and then talk to them about other drugs that you haven't picked out. And through there, you're interleaving doing topics A, B, and C, but you're also doing space practice as you're giving time between lists to then talk about things as well.
Anemic hypoxia, and
Hmm.
then seeing in action about how you manage it, that also reinforces the learning. So those concrete examples are so important.
And overall, I think that makes you better clinical doctors. If you can actually utilize the things that you're trying to learn in the primary in your actual everyday practice, because then you don't start to hate the things you learn in the primary. Most people, when they get through the primary, will say that they never want to read any primary textbook again or read their notes again. But everything in the curriculum, and this sounds very cliche of me to say, is in there for a reason. It's in there for a safety reason that's important for patients, and it's in there for you to know because on a day you might need to use that information. And if you can see how that information then applies to a clinical context, you will appreciate that information a lot better. And that can also be a way that you can ignite conversations.
Yeah,
And then finally, it's dual coding, which kind of segues nicely into finishing kind of this podcast because dual coding is all about how can you cover the same topics in different ways. And that might be an audio format like this podcast. It might be in a visual format, such as the document that we're going to release, or it might be writing things down. And so that's really important. There's great examples of dual coding on the website. I think we have Kate's tables that go through some different type of pharmacology principles.
can I just add to that?
Yeah.
The aspect of dual coding can also be strengthened by replicating the diagrams yourself. It is useful having the information, the brain working with two different types, the written and the drawing. But if you can replicate those drawings yourself as well, that will strengthen the situation.
I hope that our conversation today, while it's a brief conversation, has ignited kind of passion between the trainees and supervisors to be better learners and more so identify learning moments and learning opportunities. Is there anything that you like to say at the end?
Again, I think in that whole summary, once again, if I was going to summarize, is again that the only person getting in the way of the trainee is really the trainee, so that they can have a mental model that says this supervisor isn't helpful, or they can look to see if there's a way of changing their mental model in their own best interest. And I think that if we had more time, we could talk a bit more about those mental models. And because people we do know, there is a power relationship, but that can be reduced. And I'm sure from your experiences, as you said earlier, there are some supervisors, it's like your mates, but there are others, it's like, whoa, hope we don't have to work with them again. But sometimes again, it's being curious, suspending judgment, and just saying, what might this person be able to do to help me?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time to join me, Maurice. I
My
think
pleasure. My pleasure.
collaborating with you on this document over summer has really, I think, improved the way I will be hopefully as a supervisor to my trainees and hopefully improve trainee outcomes, but also just make me a better person in the hospital environment and the way I look after patients as well. So
You've done a great lot of work on that website. The resources are great, but you taking the time, you need to be applauded for the work you're doing here at the moment.
thank you. And thanks for everyone listening. And I know the exams are coming up soon. And so I hope that this document that we'll release very shortly will help people both for the written and in Viva practice. And it's going to be accompanied with the other 6 strategies that we've talked about at the end of this podcast. So keep an eye out for this. And thanks again, Horace. And
Thank
thank you
you.
everyone for listening on Count to 10.